Okay, can you see that? Big
Yes.
yellow thing for a video. Okay, here we go. This is on the Euthyphro dilemma. And I've chosen this one. There are a lot of them on the internet, of course, but I've chosen this one because it puts the matter as forcefully, maybe even offensively as it can be put. But that'll help us to feel how this whole matter looks to some people.
Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at the Euthyphro dilemma. This is a dilemma for divine command theory. If you don't know what those things are, stay tuned, I'll explain them. A quick warning before we get started though, this is a basic introduction to the Euthyphro dilemma. If you want more information, check out Euthyphro by Plato, or Religion and Morality on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'm not going to be covering everything in Euthyphro here, just the main dilemma. With that out of the way, let's get started. Now, the belief that we're going to be testing here is something called divine command theory. This is actually a pretty common belief. If you believe that morality comes from God, comes from the Bible, church, the Torah, the Quran, what have you, you believe in some version of divine command theory. Basically what it says is that God dictates morality. We get our morality from God. God tells us what's good and bad, and he tells us what's right and wrong, what we should and shouldn't do. If you believe in some version of that, this is a problem for you. The dilemma is formulated as follows. Basically, it's a question. Does God say things because they are good? Or are things good because God says that they are good? In other words, is God reading out of a manual and just telling us what should be good? Or is God actually writing the manual as he goes, and whatever he says becomes good? Being as this is a dilemma, you have to choose one of those positions if you want to stick with divine command theory, but neither of them are going to seem too appealing. Let's take a look. On the first horn of the dilemma, God seems impotent because God says things because they are good. Basically, there's some other reason outside of God that things are good. God doesn't define the rules, he just really reads them to us. God cannot do everything. He's somehow constrained by the rules of morality, which are outside of his control because he didn't create them. And God isn't required for morality. Morality would exist if God didn't exist. And if God stopped existing, morality would continue. And there's something out there that God didn't create. That is morality. Basically, if the rules of morality dictated that God must act a certain way, he would be powerless to disobey. So it seems like under this horn, God's omnipotence is a little limited, and he seems not necessary for our daily lives because morality exists outside of him. The second horn of the dilemma has the opposite problem. This is things are good because God says so. It makes morality really seem arbitrary. If God started making everyone suffer by creating a giant hurricane that killed a bunch of people, that would in fact be good. Even if we thought it was bad, it would in fact be good that those people died. God cannot be judged as good because he couldn't be otherwise. His omnibenevolence seemed inconsequential because he is the definition of good. If God stopped existing, there would be no more morality. And if God never existed, good and bad would have just been in our heads and been something that was completely a fabrication. And there's no deep reason for morality. God kind of just made it up, because if there was some deeper reason, we'd be on the first horn of the dilemma. If God demanded there was a yearly murder of 100 children, that would in fact be what is good. It wouldn't be oppression. It would in fact be something good, and fighting against it would be bad. One way or another with this dilemma, you're going to have to bite a bullet. If you fall on the first horn, it seems God's omnipotence is limited, morality is possible without God, and God's not a creator anymore. He's just a transcriber of morality. On the second horn, God's omnibenevolence. God can make anything he wants good, be that suffering of people, what have you. And there's there's no deep reason for what is good. Based in reason, based in pain and suffering or pleasure, there's no reason for one thing being good over something else. The point of all this is it seems either way you fall with divine command theory, you're going to have to make sacrifice. Being a good skeptic, I would say this is a good reason to reject or at least suspend judgment on divine command theory. I'll leave you with a quote from a renowned biblical scholar, J.Z. Is pious pious because God loves pious? Socrates asked, whose bias do y'all see? Stay tuned for more videos at carneades.org. Stay skeptical, everybody.
Okay, there you go. That's the youthful dilemma, and one runs into it very rapidly at any opening of any book on religious ethics. This is just Religious Ethics 101. One has to deal with the youthful dilemma. So what would Thomas Aquinas say in response to that, you think? Anybody?
May I venture?
Yes.
The thing that bothers me about this speaker is that it seems to be, how do I say, kind of a little bit trivial. In the sense, it's almost like asking, can God do nonsense? And then accusing him for not being able to do it because he wouldn't do it. But if he did it, then you'd say, well, he's flawed because he did it. It's the kind of double talk that bothers me whenever I encounter it. It's also like the accusation about, can't God build a mountain that he cannot move, or some such thing. C.S. Lewis has already argued these kinds of points as nonsense, and basically saying, look, you can mount arguments that inherently are nonsense, and just putting God in front of it doesn't somehow justify the argument.
Well, now, when it comes to God's omnipotence, people will say things like, God can do anything except that which is self-contradictory. And so God can't make a four-angle triangle and things like that. The question is there that kind of definitiveness in the moral life as well? Are there some things that are so self-contradictory that even God could not command it? Could God command us to have a society in which there is no respect for possessions, for instance?
Well, may I venture to suggest that, in fact, all of moral law is, in fact, just that. For example, to illustrate, Cain understood that once he killed his brother, because the first thought that came to him, oh, now anybody that I encounter might kill me too. By that extrapolation, our entire race is doomed. You see, as you mentioned before, without some basic principles, no society is possible, simply because it undermines itself.
Now, I want to agree with you on that, but I want to go a step further and say God couldn't even make that society work without that principle.
In fact, there is no conceivable universe where inherent falsehood could be made to function as a rule of law.
Okay, so what would then, we agree on that, but what would Aquinas say to the Euthyphro dilemma? What would his response be? The two options are either God conforms to some external standard, or God arbitrarily decides what's right or wrong. Those are the two options, right? God conforms to some external standard, or God arbitrarily, like William of Ockham would say. What would Aquinas say to that? And what should we say?
But one has to ask oneself, is God's objective a certain kind of how should I say, primary, is God's primary objective a certain kind of appearance or reputation, or is primary objective actually to do something that is inherently consistent and sustainable?
Okay, consistent with what?
Inherently, internally consistent.
Okay.
You cannot create anything that is going to be internally inconsistent. Otherwise, it won't stand. As Jesus pointed out, if a kingdom is turned against itself, it won't stand. You know, this kind of reasoning that some people apply in order to justify doing what they want to do, as you know, suggests that they are not sufficiently familiar with the absolutely foundational principle of cause and effect. We
Okay.
want the rights, but we don't want the accompanying responsibility for exercising those very rights. That
Okay.
is the problem.
All right. So I think Aquinas would agree with you that God has to honor moral principles that are consistent with himself. But I think Aquinas would go further than that in a way that pertains to the Euthyphro dilemma. I think he would say God acts in harmony with God's own essence. The laws which God recommends to us are not external to God's own being. It's not as though God, in honoring them, has to conform to something outside of God. There is a third option which the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't give us, and that is these laws could be expressive of what kind of being God is. Now, let me try an illustration. Forrest, does anybody else want to get in here? I don't hear.
At some point, I like, this is McKinley.
Okay, let me get you in here, McKinley. But let me just make a point and then make a practical point. That is, first of all, when someone tells you you have only two options, you say no, just as a matter of fact. I have always more than two options, right? Just say that right up front. Secondly, in this case, the third option is that neither are these expectations arbitrary, nor does God have to conform them as though they were some kind of external standard, but they are expressive of God's own essence, God's own character. So here's an illustration. When a father or mother takes good care of the child, is that parent doing so out of conformity to some external obligation which says, thou shalt take good care of thy children? Or is that taking care of the child expressive of that person's own character? And I think that's that point here. Even animals seem to have regard for their own offspring that seems to be part of their very identity. And so we don't have to posit God's law as somehow external to us or to God, such that God has to conform to them. Now, let's remember, the Euthyphro dilemma comes out of a very different context. Socrates asks Euthyphro this question, but Socrates asks, what would the gods, plural, say is pious? First of all, he's talking about piety, not ethics. But secondly, Euthyphro is dealing with a plurality of gods, not one God. And this plurality of gods are sometimes good and sometimes bad. But Jews, Christians, and Muslims agree there's one God, and that God is essentially good, at least if we follow Aquinas. And out of God's essential goodness, not in conformity to something else, out of God's essential goodness comes the law. And this is rational. This is reasonable. Now, why make a point of it? Just this. And this is very serious to my way of thinking. A lot of Adventists have grown up thinking that the moral life consists of appealing and deferring to authority. We can have a lot of discussion as to what the authority is, but in the end, the appeal is to authority. And when that's the appeal, it's very easy to take one authority out and replace it with another authority and be as deferential to that other one as one was to the first. So, practical illustration. David Koresh recruits people for Waco at the Loma Linda University market. And these people defer to him just as though they were deferring to Ellen White or just as though they were deferring to the Bible. And even when he said the most outrageous things, by virtue of the fact that he was kind of a William Ockham deity, they obeyed. And they died.
Mhm.
And some of them were very, very bright. These were students at Loma Linda University who went up in flames at Waco because they were overly deferential to authority. That's a serious matter. There was one fellow from the Sligo church who was a lawyer, graduated from Harvard, who went up in those flames too. He deferred to David Koresh because he became convinced that David Koresh was God's messenger, and he was not able to stand up and say no, even to someone who claimed to be God's messenger. This is a very, very serious matter. And that's why I'm saying God's commands are related to God's essential goodness, and God's essential goodness is rational, it's reasonable. And if someone makes an unreasonable expectation of you in the name of God, be very careful. When David Koresh said to all the members of his tribe, God gathered them all together and said, well, I've just received a revelation from God that from now on, you are to remain married to each other, but I am to have the only privileges for sexual intimacy with all the women in the tribe. And all the men have to defer to my authority in this matter, and God has said so. And they went along with it. Now, you would think people would say, no, I don't think so. That doesn't make sense. God doesn't ask us to do things that don't make sense. No, you can't be speaking for God. We're not going to do that. But they did. There's a really rough portion of some of the records out of Waco where the recordings here record people saying to each other as they're starting the flames there, do you really believe this is what God wants us to do? The answer is yes. Are you sure this is what God wants us to do? Of course. It doesn't make sense to me, but you say God wants us to do it? Yes. You go back and forth like that, and then it goes silent. This is serious.
It's frightening.
Okay, who is going to be next? McKinley, Forrest, who's next?
Yeah, McKinley's next.
Okay, thank you, David, for your thoughtful presentation. I think just before I say what I wanted to say, I'd like to just comment on this the last statement you made. I don't think God expects us to have unquestioned obedience to authority, and I think people who find themselves in that mindset don't understand or perhaps ignore certain principles in the scripture about understanding and Isaiah 1:18, come let us reason together, and so on and so forth. I think God wants us to have a relationship with him that is based on reason and understanding. Now, to your question about what Mr. Aquinas would say to the Euthyphro dilemma, I think first I find a lot of what the gentleman said very simplistic and limited and inconsistent. And I find myself agreeing with Danilo in that respect. I think Mr. Aquinas would probably suggest that there's a third option like you were suggesting, Dave. And I find that this dilemma is a variant of the flight from authority framework. And I think that we should question authority and particularly if that authority is different from what we understand to be perhaps expressions of God's character. I think divine will or divine action is constrained by God's character, as you were referring to as well, David. So I think Aquinas will suggest that there is a third alternative to the two horns of the dilemma the gentleman presented. That's what I want to say.
Okay, I agree with you on that. Yeah. Forrest, anybody else want to get in
we
here?
got Jeff Cahill.
We unmuted. Oh, I'm not sure what I have to say is relevant anymore, except that I think we have examples, at least in the Bible, that God himself needs to be questioned sometimes. Certainly Abraham did that when the three visitors came along and were planning the destruction of Sodom, and he bargained. I think he should have questioned God when he got the command to take Isaac up and sacrifice him. I think when you get a command that purports to be from God and it seems to be inconsistent with the basic principles that you hold, it's time to question. It's time to question. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I think is so good about Matthew Cortman's book, Saying No to God. I think he picks up on that. Now, there's a big difference between Islam and Judaism, Islam on the one hand and Judaism and Christianity on the other. Have you noticed that the word Islam means submit, and the worship service consists of bowing? But then compare that to the stories of the heavenly messengers approaching people in the Bible. And almost always, when these heavenly messengers arrive, the human being falls to his or her knees in fear and adoration. And every time that I can recall, the angel says, stand up. Fear not and stand up. It's a very different approach to things. There are some religions who say the key virtue is submission, but Judaism and Christianity are not among those religions. They say, stand up, don't be afraid, question, inquire, probe, and I would add, in my own words, always think for yourself, never think by yourself.
You know, one of the famous lines from Paradise Lost is Milton's statement of his purpose in writing the poem, to justify the ways of God to men. And I think as the stories are told to us, sometimes the ways of God, or what appear to be or purported to be the ways of God, you need justification. And no matter how well talented theologians like yourself, David, try, defend what appear to be, to me at least, in a more simple level, to be malicious acts on God's part. And I'm inclined to think that the malicious acts are attributed to God, but in fact they are malicious acts of the people who are writing the stories, or telling the stories, or transmitting those stories and attributing some of the things that people have done to commands from God. So it seems to me that a questioning, skeptical attitude is useful throughout life, and certainly in terms of studying the scriptures and in deciding whether or not to follow certain kinds of advice. Sometimes if someone is truly an authority in an area, I'm not going to question, and I'm not going to substitute my judgment, for instance, for my oncologist if I had one. I don't have one, but in many other kinds of areas, I think it's incumbent upon us to stand up and question. It's a moral duty to be skeptical or to question authority. It's not
Yeah,
a choice.
I'd like to comment in a couple of ways on that. One of them is that presumptive authorities are essential for life, but I think there is no absolute human authority, none whatsoever. All authority in human life is presumptive and not absolute, and it's really important to make that point. Secondly, I'm not among those who are going to provide some justification for what God is pictured as saying in the early part of the First Testament, killing all these neighbors and so forth, killing them all except for the beautiful young women and bringing them home. Now, I don't think God said that. I think that that's what people thought God said, but I don't think God said that. Because I don't think that that's consistent with the understanding of God we have elsewhere. What we have in the Bible, I think, is a record of what people understood God to be saying. And therefore, we have to refrain from attributing these words directly to God. And Ellen White says as much. Yeah, who else wants to jump in here?
Elmer had raised it. Capino, you had made a comment in the chat. Do you want to follow up on that? You're on silent, Elmer.
Can
There.
you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. I come from a different angle here. I do forensic psychiatry evaluation, and in almost all my cases, these people that are found guilty know exactly what they're doing. So to think that there's two sets of morality, we all think just about the same purpose. Some people just want to get out, and maybe they can get away with it. That's my experience.
Interesting.
Okay. Gerald Winslow.
Oh, hello and happy Sabbath. Thanks, Dave.
I got you, Peter, by the way.
Took us on a tour of the high Middle Ages there, and good review of having deep thoughts about John Duns Scotus for a while, so that's good. And I always learn from you. I understand your concern about the ethos of Adventism at times, and I'm sure we've all encountered that. It seems to me that as denominations go, though, we have a much higher view of human reason and the ability to question and think things through than some others I've seen. And sometimes I think it's a matter of temperament or perhaps educational opportunity or whatever. I don't think the sort of bumper sticker, God said it, I believe it, that's good enough for me, would sell very well at a sciences university. We hold each other accountable to look for evidence. And I think that reaches throughout the way we think about all truth. I did think about this with you and Donna and others. I was thinking about biblical examples, and Abraham, when he's bargaining there, saying, wait, the maker of heaven and earth, of all beings in the universe, ought to know something about fairness. You'd better get this right. In fact, one Hebrew scholar says that's about as strong as you can make the Hebrew language. He's shouting at that point. Or I think of the opening of Habakkuk, where he's wanting to know why bad people prosper, and he's not going to be satisfied till he gets better answers. But my mind did turn to Job, who says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I might have a hard time saying that. I guess you could only say it once and really mean it. But the very next phrase in that sort of poetry that he has there, even so, I will defend my own ways. That's the next phrase. And the next one, he'll be my salvation, but there's no room for hypocrites. So I think that you can kind of sense the tension in those passages. I think the Adventism that I admire the most is actually much more congenial to the kind of conversation we're having here now. Maybe not every place, but at least in Loma Linda.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. I see Peter has his hand up, and then Bud, you have your hand up. Peter, you go.
Could I just comment on what Jerry said just for a second?
Sure.
This, I don't know if you were here when I talked about chapel and what that preacher said up front about the coffee table. I think that man who was a leader in the Adventist church simply did not understand Adventism. And that's what's scary. And that is that some people who are in positions of influence don't understand the Adventist heritage on this very matter and say things like that. And so, yeah, we need to keep in touch with our own heritage on these matters. Thank you.
I've heard similar stories. I'll just drop one in since it's wintertime and snowing someplace, but not here. But it had to do with a little kid on a sled, and the sled was going downhill. And what the little kid didn't realize is he was about to run in a barbed wire fence. And his father just hollered at him. Maybe you've heard that illustration. The father yells at him to just get down, and the kid instantly gets down, and that's what saves him from getting chewed up by the barbed wire. And the reason for that illustration that I heard when I was a teenager was that when you get a command like that from somebody in authority, you just do instantly what they said. That's the only safe way. And it was offensive to me then, and it still is. So.
Okay.
Well, in an emergency, one might have to exercise authority very powerfully, right? I mean, in an emergency situation.
I don't, sure, as a story, and if it was true, you're glad that the kid was saved. As a rule for life, it's a bad one.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. Peter, do you?
Yes, when you, Dave, announced this topic, you insisted on to understand the pre-modern times, that in this way we are going to understand better these people that we were mentioning, René Descartes, Occam, Dunn, and others. And I think we should insist a little bit on the pre-modern era, which basically started, the modern era starts approximately in the 15th century and going up to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Then to understand a little bit what happened in the pre-modern era, you started with the 13th century, and I think it's a good start. But I will start with the Lateran Council in 1215, when Pope Innocent III formulated basically the doctrine of papal supremacy. The Pope became the supreme arbiter in the theology, especially in the theological problems. But in this pre-modern society, which was basically an agrarian society in which most people were illiterate, they only the monks and the priests knew how to read and write. They were the ones that were basically the people in charge with the authority. What they were saying was a fact, was authoritarian. And the church was having what was called the magisterium. That means the church was the supreme interpreter of the Bible. And with the Pope, of course, the supreme interpreter in these problems. But then it came, it came the Renaissance in the 14th, 15th centuries. And with the Renaissance, we added to the Bible and the church interpretation of the scripture, we have also added Plato, Aristotle, and as you mentioned, Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. Well, it was less preoccupation with the authority of the Bible and more preoccupation, especially with the Greco-Roman values that were considered the perfect values. And of course, if in the previous pre-modern society, God was considered the supreme good and truth and beautiful and just. Now, some questions started. Books like On the Dignity of Man appear, and it was more preoccupation with the man that God. And then you mentioned an evolution also in authority came also in during the Reformation. You mentioned Martin Luther with his main statement of the Diet of Worms in 1521. When he was mentioning that there are two things basically that he should be judged in his books on. That is the Holy Scripture and also a sound reason. But there is also something else that contributed to different evolution of authority. In 1450, Gutenberg invented the printing press. And with that, the literacy spread. And Martin Luther contributed to that when he translated the Bible and encouraged basically the people to read the Bible and to read it for themselves, not waiting for magisterium of the church, but that they were able to interpret the Bible for themselves, and then authority rested also. I mean, the people, the ordinary people were involved in this because they could do that. And
okay, I need you to come to a conclusion here pretty soon so we can get some other people in. What I'm hearing from you so far, Peter, is that this, on the one hand, the emphasis upon authority intensified in the preceding period. On the other hand, there were counter pressures. Another one would be the conciliar movement and so forth. Even the increasing independence of the orders, all of those started to work away against the papacy. But you're right, there was this forcefulness on growing authority, but on the other hand, pressure back against it. Do you want to say anything more real quickly?
Yeah, well, just to conclude, is that where all these different opinions and the evolution of authority, the way we have it in the time we are living, well, we can mention Friedrich Nietzsche with his Death of God, and he brought a kind of nihilistic attitude when he said that God is dead. That meant that we are now living in a universe that doesn't have any purpose. And we have to create a purpose for our lives. As an artist is creating a purpose when he's creating something.
Okay,
Then,
I'm gonna pause right there, okay, Peter? Because I think that, to me, the modern era ends right there. You know, we hear sometimes that the modern era ended in the 1960s. I think when Nietzsche says that and Freud comes along and says that, or what he did and Darwin says that, what he did, you know, Nietzsche, Freud, and Darwin, they really erode our confidence in human freedom in different ways. So I think that to posit the beginning of the postmodern era in the 1960s is way too late. But we'll pick that up next week. Okay, who's next?
Bud, did you have something you wanted to ask or comment?
You know, I guess I would say something now. We always say that Nietzsche said that, but I was reading, and I believe this to be true, that Nietzsche said that because of the hypocrisy that the leaders of the Catholic Church had in those days. They were so ridiculous that Nietzsche said, God must be dead. That's the comment that I would have. I suppose coming back to the previous discussion with Donna and Jerry, perhaps, when I was 27 years old, I was a circuit court probation officer in Oakland County, Michigan. and I wrote pre-sentence investigation reports on adult felony offenders, both men and women. And typically I would try to interview the defendant first, and then proceed to attempt to verify comments and issues. And oftentimes when the person was not out on bail, I would visit them in jail. And I would leave the jail thinking, wow, this guy sure got a bum rap. He's such a great guy. And then subsequently would learn that the fellow had conned me terribly with regards to more of a historical perspective from other people. At any rate, I'm sorry I got in late on all of this. I hope to pick it up again on YouTube. My son-in-law came from England and flew into Ontario today. And so therein was the reason why I missed the lecture, but I hope to pick it up on YouTube. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, bud. You did the right thing. Got your priorities straight. I think we need to conclude here, unless there's somebody who's really wanting to say something before we end.
I would just say that Ellen DeRico had a comment on the chat, and I don't think Ellen has spoke to our group. Ellen, did you want to respond to that chat comment?
Well, I was thinking when I was watching the experiment with the electric shock, and I think, those participants I think they trusted the men in the white coats because, they figured that, they wouldn't do anything unethical. I mean, after all, we have IRBs now and all of that. And so I think there was a certain element of trust there that they believed is in a way why they went forward. And I think in the Adventist church, I think a lot of people, we're drawn to that authority that, I know in myself, I've listened to preachers that I figured, oh man, they really studied the Bible and they really know a whole lot more than I do. And then you find out, they did some discretion and you're devastated because you trusted them and then your trust was violated. So I think there's this element of trust. Do we say, are we too trusting? Should we be less trusting of all authority figures, or can we only trust some authority figures? Where do we put our trust, I guess is my question.
I think Paul in 1 Thessalonians, which is the very first thing written in the New Testament, what does he say? He says, don't despise the prophets. In other words, have an open mind. Test everything. Test everything. Don't be gullible. Have an open mind and don't be gullible. And thirdly, keep what's right and don't keep what's not. So when Paul says test everything, I think he means everything. I've heard people say, well, no, that means you can test this, but not that. No, Paul says test everything. And yeah, be willing to listen to alternative points of view, but be sure to test what one hears so that one's not led astray. Okay, after the benediction, we're going to stay by. And those of you who want to are surely welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about finances and review where we've been as a group financially over this year and where we might be going. We're not going to be asking for money from anybody, but we'd like you to know where we are and what we think we might do and how supportive we might be of some projects here and elsewhere. So you're surely welcome to stay by. We'll quit at 1 o'clock and we'll see what happens. So here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Janella, we didn't get back to you. Hold on till next week.
Dave McKinley here.
Yeah.
I got a question that you don't have to answer right now, but perhaps if you're talking next week, you can consider this question. To what extent do you think that our willingness to defer to authority is based on the fact that we do live in society and our everyday experience is defined by a world of authority? The things we do, our driving, the codes and standards, and all of these things that we comply with are based on an embodiment of authority. So to what extent does that carry over into our spiritual experiences? So that's the question. Don't have to answer it today.
Well, I just agree with you. It doesn't, right. And all of that's necessary. We can't have a society without a whole bunch of presumptive authorities, but we ought not to give them absolute standing. They should always be questionable, it would seem to me. Okay, let's turn over to some financial considerations. Forrest, can you kind of bring us up to date as to where we are financially?
Yes, yes. Thank you. We work with the church office, church treasurer's office, which, by the way, they've had some quarantining over there because of COVID, but everybody's doing okay right now. Just getting behind on things. Our Sabbath school has about $14,000 to $15,000 available for our use, within reason. And so we have been discussing honoraria, which we have given to several. We also want to make some gifts to different organizations that we think are worthy. And the one that spoke to us last week, we're going to give something there. And then my thinking too is that we live in a broader community, and sometimes Adventists are not seen as being participants. And so I'm going to be suggesting some local charities that are not Adventist, so that the non-Adventist community can see who we are, as well as we can participate in their goodness, because we're part of that community. So David, you want to talk about the honoraria, or are we not going to need to?
Maybe I'll just say a word or two about that, because it's been a perplexing situation. In the past, we provided honoraria for those who came to us from some great distance. But the criterion of distance doesn't seem to work so well in the world of Zoom. And so we've tried to work our way through it. And last year, that is the year that's just ending now, I finally ended up saying, okay, those who did series would get an honorarium, but those who did one-time presentations wouldn't. And yet, on reflection, that seems to me to be arbitrary and not defensible in the long run. I don't have any regrets about what we did this year, but in the long run, I think we might need something that's more consistent and standard. And after looking over it a lot of different ways and talking with Elder Brunsma, what we're leaning toward now is to give everyone a modest honorarium every time. And so that might be a $100 gift certificate to Amazon or something like that. But that this would mean that those who present series this coming year would get considerably less than they got this year. But on the other hand, everybody would get something. So it's a perplexing situation, but that's where our thinking is as of now. That is, we provide a modest, it's not even an honorarium, maybe a gratuity, and then make that consistent across the board. So there's so much per presentation, whether it's part of a series or not part of a series. That's our thinking, and I'm surely looking forward to reactions. If you have strong convictions as to whether that's a good way or a bad way to go, we'd like to hear them. Now, Forrest has done some scouting on the things we might support. I might say something about Norma Nashed's approach, and I really enjoyed her presentation and benefited a lot from it. But you know, I thought we might contribute $1,000 and that would be helpful. And yet, as I listened to her, she's looking for gifts in the tens of thousands of dollars, and that sort of gave me pause. And I know some of you are exploring the possibility of giving to her in those numbers, and that's fine. But I don't think we're in a position to do that. At least my thinking would be, well, let's give them $1,000 and see how that goes. And maybe next year do a little bit more. But I don't see us giving $1,000 a month. But if you have strong convictions on that too, I'd like to hear it. We don't ask for money here. What we do, I think, is to say, okay, here are some options. And as you look over the many good places, you could make a philanthropic investment. Maybe you could consider us as one of the possibilities, but be led by what you are persuaded is the best thing for you to do this time. That's where we are on that, and also on the Norma Nashhead approach. I think she's disappointed that I haven't thought in bigger terms, but I think this is a good way to start, and let's see how it goes. Now, somebody said, well, we should give them $10,000 out of our 15. Let us know. That's not my view at the moment. Now, go ahead.
David Budd had his hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, David, the latter comment. I would just want to make a statement with regards to honorariums. An honorarium is a token of appreciation for something that has been done. It really should not be equated with, in my opinion, the value of the contribution. Do you know what I'm saying? The value of the lecture contribution. It's simply a token. Thank you so much. You gave so unreservedly, and out of the kindness of our hearts, so to speak. Here's a token of appreciation. I think that's understood to be the honorarium.
Okay.
And then I really don't think personally that we're in a position as a committee, as the Branson Legacy Sabbath School, to be that philanthropic unless we had a significant treasury to operate on. $10,000 is a whole lot of money, pretty well depletes us. I think coming back to Norma, yes, she's interested in raising money, and that's understandable. But then her effort was pretty well broadcast among us and others that will listen, and she should be grateful for that. And yes, a token of appreciation for her contribution is appropriate, but certainly keep in mind that we're really not. We do not have the financial basis as, say, a foundation that has a significant amount of resources, and it's required to distribute some of that on an annual basis. That's my thinking.
Okay, so that's a double message, I think. On the one hand, we are going to be judicious on how much we give as a group. On the other hand, there are members of the group who, as individuals, are planning to give a lot more, and I don't know altogether about that. And I would really rather not know about that. People who are going to do that can work with Norma and Ed Turner directly. But that's good. That's one reason why we had her on board, because we thought she has a program that might be of interest to some people. Okay, anybody else?
Donna?
Well, I think I'm, again, just going to echo David on that. I think what we gave to Norma, and it was a big gift, was providing her a platform from which to address a lot of people who might be interested in her particular charity, which by the way, I think is excellent and very admirable that she's used her life in this way to rescue so many children. But I don't think that as a class, we should focus or disperse a lot of our somewhat
Okay.
hoard. David, if anybody and I just want to add, and if anybody deserves an honorarium, it would be probably you and Forrest, just for keeping the thing going for so long and putting so much time into it. So if we're going to talk about time and trying to pay people for time, there's some things that you can't pay people for. I mean, unless you want to submit, unless you two want to submit a bill, then, you know, the committee will take a look at it. But, so I think there are some things that are not commodifiable and ought not to be commodified in this particular setting.
I would like to jump in.
Very helpful. Go ahead.
I would like to jump in here and second the motion with regards to Donna's recent comment. It's Christmas time. And I don't know if it needs to be a motion, but there should be something tangible given to the people that are leading out in this tremendous committee. And I can't help but think everybody would agree with that somehow, some way. And whether or not, I don't know just exactly how we would proceed, but I certainly would make a motion that something be done in a tangible way financially for the leaders of this committee, mainly David and Forrest and others that are more quiet and behind the scenes. But how do we begin to do that, Donna? Do we just quietly get together and decide, or I'm not sure just how to handle it.
Could we put that on hold? That's a very, very gracious and generous offer. I think that I'm hesitant to think in those terms.
Of course you would, David, because you're the leader.
Yeah.
And so we need to kind of let you step aside on this, in my opinion.
Okay. But then step aside and then maybe have lunch and talk it over. Can't have lunch, but have a Zoom meeting and talk it over, because it's a little awkward for us to do that.
I understand.
Thank you, though, Bud. I really appreciate the interest you have. Forrest, could you tell us about the charities you have in mind?
Yes, I'm going to try to get them up on the screen here. Okay, there's hang on just a minute. I need to, okay. There are 4 charities that I'm suggesting that are part of our community that we should consider for a smaller gift. And the first one's part of the Redland Symphony. And they have a special program in the Redland Symphony that is for kids. It's called the Orchestra. And they work with the Redlands Unified School District as well as private schools in the greater Redlands, Loma Linda, Highlands area. And so I'm suggesting that we give $250 to the Redland Symphony for the Orchestra program. I'd like to go to the second one. And this is, it's something we don't consider too often here in the area, but we have a lot of homeless kids. And there's an organization called Youth Hope Foundation. And the things that they do is they have a food and clothing closet for children, for kids. They have a continuing education and job training. They actually help young people learn how to write a resume. And recently they had one young man didn't have a suit or anything. And so they were able to get him one. They have medical and counseling services. And I think that's, and housing. There's these kids, a lot of these are called couch kids, in the sense that they can't live with their parents anymore. They're druggies or they've abandoned them. So they go to a friend's house and they sleep on the couch for 2 or 3 weeks and then they move on. They're right here in Redlands on the corner of Redlands Boulevard and Alabama. Used to be a fish restaurant in there, but they've redone that. And I'd like to suggest, again, a gift of $250 for them. Now, the next one, you're gonna be taken back just a little bit. I'm gonna pull it up. And it's called Daisy Hope Foundation. And this organization works directly with animals, cats and dogs and bunny rabbits, but cats and dogs primarily.
I'm sorry, I can't get.
And my wife and I, we adopted a cat from them this year, kitten, because we lost ours. Anyway, but I think the exciting thing about these folks is they have a pet food pantry. And this is for people, senior citizens or people who are out of work that are coming into a hard choice, whether to keep their animal or give it up to a shelter or whatever. And you know, animals are very important to me. And I think this serves people in our community in a way that we don't normally think of. They actually have a pantry out at Norton Air Force Base, former Air Force Base, which provides food for seniors and people out of work that have to come to a point of paying their rent or getting rid of their animals. And this way, it helps people become, they can keep their animal. They also have a neutering program if needed. So anyway, that one. Then my last one, again, $250 to them. And then the last one is, I wasn't quite sure, but there are many food banks here in Redlands. And we have the Salvation Army, we have the Redlands Family Services, the Blessing Center. There are several others, and I haven't actually decided which one I think would be the best. I mean, they're all very good. And we know from watching television that food is becoming a very important source for a lot of people. So I'd like to suggest that we give $250 to one of these organizations, not to be decided between David and myself. So, so those are the four, David, that I'm recommending that we give $250 a piece to in the name of the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School class. We're helping our community and we're letting people in our community know that that we appreciate them.
Okay, so what we're thinking about is to contribute $1,000 to restore a child and then divide a second $1,000 in these four ways. And I wonder if there's anybody who has a strong conviction one way or the other on any of this.
I think it's wonderful.
In terms of the pantry, Helping Hands Pantry is one that I've looked into and one that Lisa and I support. Their reach is very broad in supporting not only their own pantries, but others in the area. So that's the one I would recommend in terms of the food.
Okay, Helping Hands Pantry. All right, thank you.
It's very local, but has tendrils out in the broad community.
Okay, thank you, Monty.
Thank you.
Also, Dave, I have a question about ways of helping with Restore a Child. I mean, one way, Lisa and I we weren't able to join the group last week. but we're interested in helping that group. But I'm just wondering, we could, of course, donate directly, but we could also donate through the Sabbath School. I don't know if the Sabbath School group is interested in that or not, but
We
I agree
could,
with
but I
Donna
think-
that giving the forum was a big way that the Sabbath School helped.
Yeah, we surely could route gifts through the Sabbath School to them. I think it might be easier for everybody just to deal directly with them.
Yeah,
It's a
that's-
very
that's
worthwhile
what we'll do.
project. It really is. Go ahead, Monty.
We'll do direct. I was just thinking if there was any benefit, that would be one. If we wanted to do it through the Sabbath School, Lisa and I would.
Okay, thank you for your support of that project. It's a very important one. Donna, were you going to say something?
Well, Forrest prefaced the presentation by saying that not all of the people of the projects he was going to recommend were Adventists. It seems to me like maybe none of them were Adventists, but maybe that's because I'm ignorant and I don't know which of these might in fact have an Adventist base. I don't think we should eliminate, if we're going to do something like this, I don't think we should exclude projects that are related to our own faith community because they're Adventists, and we should actively look for things outside. I understand the argument about, or the position that we need to reach out into the community, but I'm not sure about, honestly, I'm not sure about the pet food pantry. I'm not, and but I'm not actively against it, but I just wonder about whether I personally feel comfortable with the Sabbath School class supporting all of these named. Of course, being a pediatrician, I'm very much in favor of Restore a Child and the Youth Hope, and the first one he mentioned, which is also related to young people and children. But that's
we might take that money and give it to Acts. I don't know what it's now called, but that would be a local Adventist charitable organization.
We could be
another
possibility.
Yeah, let's think about that. Okay, that's helpful. Yes, one.
John.
Okay, I think this is a helpful discussion, and I learned a few things. One is the need or the interest in the honorarium, and I think it could be necessary in some occasions, but and I think it's appropriate to offer that, but doesn't mean that the individual needs to take it. So I've been offered many times honorariums that I don't take it because the organization is not really geared for business, or I think is inappropriate, and sometimes I take it and I give to another charity. It depends. So I don't think we need to make as a mandate, that we have to give $100 per lecture per presentation. Definitely, we want to budget that, and that quickly, that means $5,000 a year, but not necessarily has to be used. That's the first point. With regard to this presentation last week, I think is a worthwhile cause. And I would differentiate the service that we provided to Norma, by giving more exposure and having people the ability to contact with her directly, and also as far as tax purposes is the same, that doing the donations through the Sabbath School. But I don't think the Sabbath School should be the means for which, it has to be also a disbursing agency for other charities in general. However, given her effort and all this, I would support having $1,000 or even more, $2,000 for her. Is Adventist that took the time to come here, so on and so forth. As far as the community, I support the idea, given that it's a small amounts. But if the amounts would be very large, I will have my objections, because again, we can do on our own and we don't have to go through Sabbath School. I realized that this year we have probably more money because we have had less expenses. I mean, as far as camera and as far as things of this sort. So I would either return, and by return is to return to the church, or save it for times that will be more difficult. But I think having donations to many other agencies, I don't think that is the forum for doing that. I support the idea to do a limited ones to the community, but I don't think we have to go into the business of being a foundation that is going to spread, I mean, all what we have collected in other sources. Anyway, that's my.
Okay, no, that's helpful advice. All right. It's a little past 1. Does anybody else want to say something before we conclude? Excuse me. This is all good counsel. And I think we're moving forward gingerly because of the new context we're in on Zoom. And we don't know how long this will last and precisely what we'll do when it's over with. But so far, so good, I would say. So far, so good. Well, thank you, everybody. We will convene this time next week.
Okay.
What time is the official starting time?
It's supposed to be 10:30.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's, we try to chat a little bit beforehand, just to.
Yeah, I turn it on usually by 10 o'clock.
Yeah, okay.
I'd just like to say, I second Joanne. I'm also concerned about the sort of precedential effect of beginning what might turn into a long-lived program of paying people and setting expectations then for some remuneration for doing the presentation. I think there might run into some problems over the long haul.
Okay.
Just a word.
Okay. So we should be cautious about that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, David, I would, if I could say something, I know you want to quit here soon.
That's all right.
I think that we're really not a philanthropic organization per se, that when we contribute to the Branson Legacy Sabbath School, we're looking in my thinking of ways to better improve our approach to communicating to our community, wherever that might be. Say better video, better microphones, and how can we better improve our image, which I think helps to get the message out. And I agree with Forrest that it's kind of nice to think in ways to make a statement to public entities, certainly not magnanimously, but participating somehow, some way too. But we're really not set up to be a philanthropic organization per se, as a foundation where we're responsible for making distributions on an annual basis, really.
Okay, that's helpful. That's very helpful. Anybody else?
I would just like to thank you for the wonderful presentation you made today.
Thank you for your responses, Daniel. This is very good. Thank you.
David, when will that be posted so I can pick it up later?
Let me check on that. I'm not quite sure. I'll check. It takes some time for them to process things. That is, by them I mean Facebook and YouTube. But I'll be in touch.
It might not happen today, or will you know when it has happened? And
I think it should be up. I'm a little apprehensive as to when the recording started. I need to check that. I thought it started right from the beginning, but we'll see. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David. Have a good week.
Thank you.